got two presenters for this next section. And so I've got two fun facts. The first presenter told me that he grew up in Montana and had 12 brothers and sisters. And because of that, he learned to talk fast and eat fast, and there were never seconds at dinner. So had to eat fast if you got 12 brothers and sisters. The second fun fact from our presenter is that one of the problems he worked on as part of his PhD thesis is how to optimize chickens flowing through a pipe. So I don't know exactly what that means. Maybe you can ask him on the break. But please welcome Jamie Engesser, VP of Product Management, and Venkat, Srikanth Venkat, Senior Director of Security and Governance. Good luck.
Thank you. I'm super excited. When I look at GDPR, I think it really opens up some doors. But we've been looking at it for the last couple of years. And when I look at the last couple of years, we've said, we've got 1.5 exabytes of data sitting in Hadoop. We've got to help the open source ecosystem do a better job with GDPR. So hopefully through this demonstration, you'll get to see some of the interesting things we're doing in that. Obviously, we're going to show you some really cool stuff. Hopefully, you guys get as excited as I do about it. So a little bit of caveat here. With that, I think GDPR is two things. One is it's this huge regulation, but I think it's this huge opportunity. When I look out over this audience, I'd like to think that everybody in this audience is a data worker at some level. Their goal in life is to make data more accessible, get more interesting facts from it, and learn from it. So if I look at GDPR, I look at it as this overwhelming sea of opportunity, but I also look at it as this overwhelming challenge. So we're here hopefully today to try to show you some of the ways that open source can help you to solve that challenge. The way we look at the building blocks for GDPR, we look at a few areas. So identify and understand. You heard that that was step one in Anza's view of the world. We completely agree. So we're going to show you some really cool capabilities in that, but how do we identify and understand data and make it easier for you? Next is how do we classify and centralize that data? And number three is how do I deal with the other side of this? I personally love the fact that Facebook notifies me every time there's a new quadcopter that shows up, right? Because it shows up there as an advertisement for me. But a lot of people don't want that. And a lot of people want that right to be forgotten. So how do I take it all the way from identifying sensitive data in my enterprise all the way over to the other side, which is deleting that data potentially, or right to be forgotten type of capabilities. So when I look at this end-to-end cycle, I look at it and it's got to be a virtuous circle in a lot of ways. We're going to hopefully show you each piece of that. Let me first start with, this is about as close to a technology diagram as we're going to get today. A couple of things. I'd like to think everybody in here knows what that bottom HDFS is. If you don't, I can talk to you afterwards. The interesting thing, and I mentioned it earlier, is 1.5 exabytes of data is a lot of data. If my goal is to classify 1.5 exabytes of data, you better get to work yesterday or the day before yesterday. So how do we help you with that? The second thing is we're going to mainly show you in that middle area, but I want to highlight to the right one of the things about cybersecurity and breach notification. One of the things we've instituted about 2 years ago in the Apache ecosystem is Apache Metron. Apache Metron is a open source cybersecurity solution built on big data to help you do that dynamic identification of breach and then notification. So it's more on the identification side, but it helps with both. There's some boxes in the middle, and I think Mandy did a great job highlighting Apache Atlas. At the end of the day, to do anything kind of above the stack, step one of anything is I got to understand the metadata and the governance, so that's where Apache Atlas comes in. The next one is how do I secure that data? That's where Apache Ranger comes in. And by the way, I need a HyperSQL engine on top of that large data store, so that's where Hive and Hive Metastore comes in. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. But we're mainly going to focus on, at first today, is that layer up on top. And probably no one in here has ever heard of it, unless you read the press release on Tuesday, but the Data Steward Studio. So let's spend a minute on the Data Steward Studio. So if you think about your step one, how do I classify data? Our primary goal for classifying data is make it easy. I want to make it super easy for you. Matter of fact, if I could just automatically classify data, life gets better. So we want to automatically classify that data, automatically organize that data, give you capabilities to do that, give you some capabilities around enterprise data catalogs, searching on that data catalog, and then ultimately securing that data. So when we look at that life cycle, that's really some of the core areas and visibility into those core areas that we care about with Data Steward Studio. With that as backdrop, hopefully that's enough backdrop because we'd rather just jump in and show you the cool stuff, but a little bit more backdrop. By the way, I love the name of this bank. I come a little biased. A couple of things I would highlight. So in this scenario, to try to give you the context, first off, we're looking at 3 global data centers. You can shockingly guess why we care about Dublin, San Francisco, and Prague, because one of them is outside the US. The second thing is there's a couple of cloud options in here too. So they got 3 global data centers that are internally managed, and then one in Amazon and one in Azure. That's where our global data centers sit. The reason you care about that is because I need to know where that data is at. The next thing I want to highlight is on the left, all the inbound sources. So there's lots of inbound sources, everything from CRM, transaction, social media, et cetera. The other side of it's all the consumption patterns, whether that's social, that's media, that's my internal audit systems, et cetera. And at the bottom, as you can guess with this whole scenario, lots of personal data. So who's the personas that we're working with? So you're going to see 2 personas. One is the data steward. And the data steward comes out of the data protection office, and they care about, their core goal is, are we protecting our data correctly? And when I've got thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees, I got to deal with, are we doing the right things? The second one is, I'm an analyst in the HR department. My name is Ivana, and I want to go get access to data, but the last thing I want to do is break any policy. So I need policy enforced for me. So we're going to show you those 2 demo personas. With that as context, 3 key things we're going to drive through. First, how do I discover and inventory the personal data? The second is, how do I centralize consent? And by the way, how do I centralize consent in a big data ecosystem? And the third one is, how do I efficiently erase a subject's data? And by the way, if I think at the lowest level, I'll give you a little secret. HDFS is an append-only file system. So there's no notion of deleting one row at a time, right? So how do I deal with that in a big data world? It's much more complex than you think. With that as context, let's have Srikanth walk through understand your personal data.
Thanks, Jamie. As Engesser mentioned before, and as Jamie talked about earlier, so the journey for GDPR usually starts with knowing what you have and where you have it. So understanding starts with the fact of locating and creating this data map or inventory. So there are many articles that kind of reference this. There's a bunch of them up here on the slide. Key here being everything that you're doing in terms of privacy or security has to start with knowing where that data is. And we'll give you some ideas on how we can do that with this Data Steward Studio product. Thanks.
Let's see it.
OK. All right. So hopefully everybody can see this here. So Michelle, our data steward working of the DPO organization, is now logged into Data Plane service. And you can see that in Hortonworks Bank, she's looking at 2 of the clusters. One is located in Dublin, the other one in Prague. And then she goes and tries to look at the Prague cluster. So this is the Data Steward Studio. She's logged in and now looking at one of the clusters. So the Prague data center has a bunch of data lakes, a data lake with a bunch of different types of data assets. And you can see some interesting summarizations we have done here. So in one shot, as she goes into this data lake, she gets a big picture view of what are the different types of data assets in there. There are different types of profilers that are being run in the background as part of Data Steward Studio that help you do interesting summarizations of the metadata. So one of the summarizations would be around, say, for example, you have Hive. You can have univariate statistical summarizers on the Hive columns, as well as things around audits for Ranger data. And then one new capability that is very, very critical that Engesser mentioned that we are adding as part of Data Steward Studio is the notion of being able to automatically profile and classify sensitive data. So what you see here is the results of that classification, profiling, and collection, all aggregated up into a single dashboard. Okay, so you see here that we have 16 Hive tables in this area. The sensitive data profile has been run. There are multiple data asset collections into which this stuff has been organized. And here are some top assets that have been accessed from this data center. Next, if she clicks into a particular asset collection, we're calling that the personal data asset collection. It has 2 tables that they've created in there with all of them being profiled. There's sensitive and non-sensitive data in there. There's a bunch of sensitive information that has been found, for example, telephone numbers, email addresses, credit card numbers, UK national ID or insurance numbers, names, et cetera. Then you also see information about who's accessed this and how frequently. You see that all of these users in the Prague data center, they've been accessing the cluster and trying to get at this sensitive data. Then you see the patterns of access over time. So in this way, Ivana and also Michelle are able to see all of the access patterns. They're able to see where the data is, what is the sensitivity levels of that from different lenses. And now we double-click into a particular asset. You can see all of the attributes of that asset. In this case, is the CRM system where the data is coming from. So it's worldwide customer data. You can see there are 50,000 customer rows in here, a certain number of columns. The profilers have run automatically, and they've classified the data. So you can see some of the classifications that have been automatically suggested by the organization in this case, and then a bunch of these profilers have been run automatically. They can be scheduled to run on demand or at any frequency you want. One of these is colored in purple, and the other ones are in blue. The blue ones are the ones that the steward has already accepted. There's a little bit of workflow built in that you can go and say the auto-suggested classifications can either be approved or rejected by the steward. So we've built in some workflow capabilities to kind of shepherd this and help organizations manage that information. You also see other very interesting summarizations here in terms of who are the top users who have touched that asset, the patterns of access, and the type of access on that. So all of this in a single page. We also mentioned that there are different types of profilers. So here are a couple. So there's one here that once you double-click into that particular customer table, you can see what the summarization here is around the column univariate statistics. So you can see the mins and max, cardinality, et cetera, and then there's the auto-classified tags or classifications here. So you can go in here, you can say, I don't like this, I don't think this really has UK IDs, and then delete that and save it, and those classifications will get applied. So these classifications are sourced from the data plane service, and they get applied onto the Apache Atlas that exists on that particular cluster. So they would automatically then be able to leverage any of the security policies that you build through the classifications. So in this way, we are supporting a workflow of classifying in the front, and on the back end, you're able to enforce security policies. Additionally, you'll also see here that we get a view into all of the policies that are on that particular asset. Notice one in particular here, there's one for consent. We'll talk about that when we go to the second part of the demo. Every single access to this particular asset has been audited, so you see the raw audit logs also here. So this way, we are able to see sort of like what we're calling an asset 360 view, all the aspects of interesting access, lineage, other metadata, so around the raw columns, rows, other structural information, shape information, access requests, and access patterns, all of those in one place for you to look at. So this, we believe, will answer a lot of those questions that you see up there in terms of challenges, where, when, what, why, when, and how, all in one page for a particular asset.
Awesome. I get super excited about that. For the first time, you've got the ability to not only have this huge data reservoir, I like it. I love the enthusiasm. You think about what this did. For the first time, you have the ability to actually go understand your data. And don't get me wrong, Hadoop's awesome. But there's never been an experience to help you understand what's out there, what's in Hadoop. This gives you that. And it gives you dynamic profiling classification as well. Let's hit on a couple more challenges before we run out of time. The first challenge I want to hit on is this notion of consent. You just heard about it in the GDPR regulations. How do I deal with consent when I talk about big data volumes? When I'm talking petabytes of data, consent's complex. Let's talk a little bit about consent. Srikanth, can you talk a little bit about it?
All right, so one of the approaches that you can take to managing consent, especially in a big data ecosystem where you have lots of data and you have to first classify, figure out where your sensitive data is, map that to the personal data of your subjects or your employees, as the case may be. And what we're trying to show here is an ability to kind of centralize that into a consent master. Let's say you have multiple applications in your enterprise that are collecting consent, and that can all be mastered into one place in your data lake, in a compliance data lake, and in there you have a consent master. Let's say it's in Hive. So what we're showing here is a very simple way for you to sort of take action based on a subject's request. So say, I don't want to be, let's take this example of Hortonworks Bank. So our friend here, Kurokawa, who lives in France, has now issued a request saying, I don't want you to spam me with any more material for your marketing campaigns. So I withdraw my consent that I had given you earlier for using my data for marketing. So let's see how that happens in the case where you have the centralized consent, and that's mastered into Hive, and then we have automatic ranger policies that are set up behind the scenes to do the filtering to affect that. So the first case, the request comes in, and we are looking now at the point of view that this is an automated job that's running, that's capturing this information. So you see, these are all the customers in France. Then we go first find the record corresponding to Kurokawa. So there it is. So we find her ID, so her unique ID is now, in this case, her insurance ID. And then using that information, we go check, has she actually given consent? Yes, she's given consent. So now, this is the view from the automated application that's collecting this information. And let's see what happens when Ivana, the analyst sitting in Prague, tries to access this. She has access to this customer's record, so she's able to see it. And then when she runs analytics on the worldwide customers table that we looked at in the data profile, there are about 2,645 records of folks who have given consent and the consent has not expired, who are EU subjects. Now, what happens when we go withdraw the consent? So the consent master table is set up with Hive Asset, which means it's a transactional table. You can do updates there. This speaks to the enhancements that we have done in the community around how do we add these capabilities to extend out our system to do asset merge, et cetera. So in this case, we're updating the consent table to say, OK, this particular row corresponding to our friend Kurokawa has to be now toggled to no, and she's now specifically withdrawn the consent for marketing. So when that happens, let's see, we confirm that the consent
is a live demo.
And there we go. So now if the analyst on the other side, she tries to run it, she's not going to see that data. And then you can see that one less record is there now. So we've effectively, because of the centralization that this offers and the Hive Asset capabilities, along with the ranger security policy that we put in place to filter the consent, look up the consent table and make sure that any time that the consent has not expired, it's for the right subject, and that right subject has, there's a change in state of that subject's consent for a particular purpose. Okay? So very easy way to manage this and centralize this. Simple demo to show you that. Right, back to you, Jamie.
Awesome. So it's hard to make SQL statements look good, but I think Srikanth showed how much potential there is between Ranger, the big data ecosystem, and leveraging a security subsystem to allow you to dynamically allocate security across any number of tables, ultimately helping us to implement consent. So I think that's a huge win. A second big win, and a couple things that I'll highlight in there. That just updated Hive tables. Hive tables you couldn't update before. That could be billions of rows that just got updated, or it could be one row within a 10 billion row table. So pretty compelling. The second thing is the Ranger application of security. Ranger's been being built up over the last 3 years, really applying it and giving you more extensive capability. With that, Srikanth, we're running out of time. Tell us a little bit about how do we get the right to be forgotten.
All right. So once again, Hive Asset to the rescue here. So what we're looking at is how do we handle this right to erasure at scale? So one of the key capabilities there that we need is the ability to update these records. First, find them at scale and efficiently, and then be able to delete those records as you get these RTBF requests. So let's see how, with this very simple use case that we have here. So what you see in this Zeppelin demo here is we have a table with all of our transactions that are coming from different POS terminals in Hortonia Bank, and that is all of the EU transactions. There's about 10 million of them in this Hive table. And then let's run a quick summary on this, and I know it's going to take a bit of time, so let's just move on and look at, while this transaction processing is happening, 11 of the customers of Hortonia Bank are saying, oh, now I want to be forgotten, so remove all the data that you have about me. So at that point, we go and say, let's do a map of how many transactions are impacted in this 10 million row table that has all of this customer data, the 50,000 customers that we looked at earlier. And then we go run that. So boom, there's your 2,200 records that are impacted. Then we use Hive Asset, very simply to go look that up and say, here's our request master in terms of who's requested the RTBF, and then we process that. And then as these transactions are coming in, we can excise the right ones and make sure that all of that information related in the customers table is all expunged. So you'll see that happening here. And then once it completes, we can go verify that all the requests, there are no pending requests on this. And you see at the bottom that you can still run the analytics at scale while this is going on. So you can do the same summarizations while the deletions are happening in parallel on the table. The other interesting part about this, before we forget, is that all of the stuff that I showed you here on this is all on S3. So it's all being done in the cloud.
So remembering the original discussion, we've got 3 data centers on-prem, but we also have data centers in the cloud. We got to deal with the same problem in the cloud. So that last scenario, great example of actually working out of S3 buckets in this case. So a couple things I would highlight there. So you got to see the notion of Hive, which supports billions and billions of rows and has been an amazing engine, now actually doing insert, update, delete. Got to have that when I talk about big data scale and GDPR support. It's a really big win. With that, let me wrap. So hopefully you guys have got to see how we do dynamic profiling, how we do large volume security and consent management, and lastly, how do we do this notion of right to be forgotten. Hopefully you see how that can help you do GDPR. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think we've done a huge step forward for the open source ecosystem. With that, last and not least, there's some opportunity for you guys to go learn more if you'd like. So here's an opportunity. And with that, Srikanth, thank you very much.
Thank you.